Glad you could join us. Emily.
So I'm Emily Buerger. I work at Alcott HR in Williamsville, New York. I have a background in communication and human resource management, as well as organizational leadership from education standpoint. I have been working at Alcott HR for just about 3 years now. Alcott HR is what we call a PEO, professional employer organization. And so we actually partner with other organizations and companies to support them in benefits, human resources, payroll, and risk management. The companies we work with really varies, smaller companies up to larger companies, variety of different industries. I did work for a private company before that, but really love what I'm doing now. It's very exciting, as you can imagine, working with different companies. And I am a human resources business partner there. So I am working with my clients essentially on human resources, best practices, compliance, and all of those types of things that fall under that umbrella.
Thank you. And Megan.
I'm Megan Kristan. I am at Refresco here in Dunkirk. I have been there for 12 years, and 10 years of that has been in HR. I really have a finance and accounting background. I realized I can't really sit behind a computer very well. I like to talk to people and mingle. So I ended up in HR, and I love it. We have about 400 employees here, and although I've only been at that company essentially at a professional level, we've been bought out 3 times, had multiple different managers reporting to. So learn a bunch of different styles. We are supposed to be experts of everything, but we rely on a network of team to kind of accomplish all of that. So.
Thank you so much. This morning we'll ask some questions, ask for answers. For our panelists, if something just doesn't feel like a topic that you feel like you want to chime in on, or maybe it's not completely relevant, or another panelist has really kind of hit all the main points, it's okay to just say, I have nothing else to add to that at this point in time, and we'll move on to the next question. And for our audience, if you have questions, just write it down maybe on something. We'll get it to Monica. I think we're going to try to hold questions until the end because we have a pretty robust line of questions that we want to get through. But certainly want to leave time to hear from you as well. We'll make sure we reserve some time at the end to hear from the audience. And we have a couple questions that were submitted in advance. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia to get us started.
And also, I want to make a side note. Emily is the Chautauqua Center's HR rep. They're wonderful if you're looking for an HR client company. So I'll just add that in.
Yeah.
So I don't have any background in HR, but I have transitioned in my role at the Chautauqua Center into recruitment and retention. And I've been working in that role for a couple of years now, and I've seen a lot happen. And obviously within the past couple of years, we've seen a lot happen. And as some of you may have heard already, it's the Great Resignation, and also they're thinking it's going to be the Great Transformation because organizations and companies are changing viewpoints and their culture and ways of going about certain things on valuing their employees. So the first question we have is, difficulties in recruitment are being seen in every sector across the country. What are some strategies you are using to get in front of candidates? What new resources or non-traditional methods are you utilizing?
Sure. Yes. All right. We use the term as no stone unturned. If it sounds like a silly idea, it may be, but you have to go out and try it. We are using billboards. You can probably find our name across the county. We've never done that before. We've also done radio ads. Not a lot of people listen to radios, but you'll be surprised. If you get one person that comes in that heard that radio ad, that's one more hire, and we're excited for that. We of course do employee referrals, but our bonuses are much higher. So we'll do like 3 months of a $2,000 employee referral, where before it used to just be traditionally $500. We of course break that out, in a year, so it's not paid out all up front, but so that helps with the retention side. Just networking and talking to people. Not rocket science, but it's you just have to give it your all and not give up. And it's frustrating, but I don't know, anything else there?
I would agree with that. Social media has been something that we've been leaning into more. It's not new. I mean, over the last several years, social media has become more and more prevalent, but leaning into that even more so now, making sure there's a presence on there, but also not relying on the advertising or things like that anymore. You really have to be hunting almost and get out there and try to source candidates yourself. Talking with our talent acquisition specialists, they were letting me know that they were like, you can post all you want, but for some of these positions, you have to go out there and you have to be reaching out to people. You kind of have to be your own advertisement. So I think that it used to be that you really only had to source for maybe higher level positions or things like that, more rare positions. Now they're finding themselves going out there and reaching out and sourcing for a lot of positions, many, many more. So I think that's a big piece of it too, really being proactive and reaching out to people.
Looking at onboarding and bringing new people in, once you've gotten them in the door and once you've gone through that interview process, what do you see as the most essential piece for onboarding new staff? How can people keep track of new hire requirements and reporting? Especially with, I think our audience is largely small business and not-for-profit. So maybe some tips there that kind of the most essential piece in prioritizing.
So first and foremost, I guess there's two pieces to this. So with onboarding, you want to ensure that it's a smooth process, because especially when it's hard to get people in, you want to make sure that once they are in, they're not getting frustrated by how long onboarding's taking, or maybe it's confusing. They don't know what paperwork to complete or things like that. So you want to try to ensure that it's as smooth of a process as possible. You want to make it quick and easy for them in whatever way that's possible for you, whether you do have the capability of doing it online with a system, even if you're using like a hello sign or something like that, so they can do it electronically. And then in order to make it a smooth process, you want to be prepared, right? So it sounds simple, but I would say, new hire checklists are very, very helpful. Create a checklist for yourself. Make sure that you have everything covered on that checklist that's going to need to be a part of onboarding. Everything from, the paperwork that's going to need to be completed, when they need to bring their I-9 documents, any training they need to do in their first week. Make sure you know how you're filing this information, right off the bat, have a file system. So we use checklists. It's very, very helpful. It seems simple, but once you have it together, it's helpful in keeping you organized and making it a smooth process.
I would add on to the checklist, it's not just for the HR or the hiring team, but also for that new employee, because typically that day one, they're either so excited, they just have a lot on their mind. They're not really retaining too much of what you're saying. So we call it our cheat sheet. When they walk away, they know exactly what they have to do in order to get benefits, in order to get the computer, all that type of thing, and with their deadline. So if nothing else, if they have to take that paper home to their spouse, because their spouse is probably asking multiple questions, what about this, what about that? It's all written on their little packet that they get to take home. And I think the other thing is, there's a big difference between orientation, which I would consider as day one, and then onboarding. People can argue it's the first, couple weeks, 30 days, 90 days, whatever it may be. It's just being organized and prepared as a team for them. And they don't need to spend, in videos and learn about safety and all that on the first week, but you do have to be organized and have your team members check in on them, with a plan, a schedule, an agenda, because the new employee is lost for a while, and it takes a little bit for them to feel comfortable. So, making it as seamless as possible is always helpful.
Joe, Ed, would you like to add anything on onboarding and kind of keeping track of requirements?
I don't think I have a whole lot to add on onboarding, really. I think that's really more of an HR business issue. I think the other two panelists have covered it very thoroughly.
Excellent.
So our next question, as we know, there's a variety of employees. Everyone has a different background. And some may require accommodations. Some may have disabilities. Some may have a disability that is seen or unseen. So our next question is, managing reasonable accommodations and employees with disabilities is important. What can small businesses do to positively engage their employees in this process and ensure compliance with legal requirements?
Can I speak to that? That was one of the issues, one of the topics that I had talked with Adam about earlier. I've represented a lot of employers who have had disability discrimination claims made against them. And what I found is the main thing I found the New York State Division of Human Rights and the EEOC is interested in hearing about is whether the employer made a sincere effort to try and accommodate the disability. And the most important part of that is the employer is supposed to engage in what they call an interactive process with the employee. So if an employee has a disability, and let's say they offer some sort of accommodation where they'd be able to do the work and notwithstanding the disability, you can't just say, no, that doesn't work. We can't hire you, or we're gonna have to let you go. You have to try and have like it's almost like a brainstorming communication type process with the employee to see if there are any other possibilities that might work. And I tell my clients, when you get involved in a situation like that, make sure you keep a record of the discussions you had with the employee, sign it and date it, put it in the file in case you ever need it to defend yourselves from a disability discrimination claim. Because what I found is, and this maybe sounds like a little bit of an overstatement, but it almost seems to me sometimes that the agencies are more interested in whether you followed this process than what the final outcome was. So that's an important thing to remember, to engage in that interactive process.
I can add to that as well. So I think from an HR standpoint internally, one thing is, making sure your managers are educated on what to keep an eye out for, right? So an example that I like to give is, if there's an employee who's falling asleep at work, yes, that's not appropriate, and that needs to be addressed, but why are they falling asleep at work? Maybe there's something going on that, they haven't brought up yet, and feeling comfortable and, looping in HR and those types of situations so they can guide you through that, and having that interactive process discussion with the employee and saying, hey, this can't be happening at work, but is there anything we can do to assist you with that? Is there anything that you need from us? So just kind of asking and going through that process with them, as opposed to just slapping disciplinary action on it and not having a further discussion about it. So really making sure that your managers feel prepared, that they feel comfortable looping you in, that they know what to kind of look out for and what conversations to have. And then it can be really helpful to have templates and workflows to go off of for these type of situations. Just initially, obviously they have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But, having templates for letters that are, provided to the employee, documents for them to fill out to request a potential accommodation, and so on and so forth. And, you can get those resources from, either working with a PEO or, if you're a member through SHRM or any of those types of things. So I think those are all very helpful as well from an HR standpoint.
We covered it well.
Okay. Hot topic, certainly in the state and gaining traction across the nation is legalization of marijuana. And that will absolutely have an impact on the workplace. What are some of the current best practices for employee screening? And how has the legalization of marijuana in New York impacted employer practices and liability? Joe, do you want to start us with this one?
Let me start on that one, please. That was one of the things that I suggested, Adam. That's one of the hottest topics I see now. As everybody knows, I'm sure earlier this year, New York State legalized marijuana. Well, recreational use of marijuana for people over 21 years of age. One of the effects of that law relates to another law that was passed in New York in the early 1990s. At that time, the tobacco industry was afraid that employers were going to stop hiring smokers because of the effect it had on insurance rates, disability, life, health insurance rates. So the tobacco lobby in the early 90s, they pressured the New York State legislature to pass a law that protected the rights of cigarette smokers. But in order to make it be not so obvious what they were doing, they wrote the law broadly enough to cover anybody who consumes any lawful substance outside of the workplace. So people can drink at home as long as they don't drink at work. People can smoke at home as long as they don't smoke at work. You don't want them smoking at work. Well, when recreational marijuana was legalized earlier this year, that became a protected activity under that law. So now, in fact, I wrote a blog for our firm's webpage right after. I said we all know about protected classes of employees. Well, the new protected class of employee is the recreational marijuana user. So unless somebody is using marijuana while they're working, or if you can prove that they're under the influence of marijuana at work, which is very difficult to do, scientifically, it's very difficult to do that. You cannot discriminate against people who use marijuana. So I've told my clients that you should not do any pre-employment drug testing for marijuana anymore. The one complication, I don't want to take up too much time, but one complication is some federal contracts require that you comply with the federal drug laws, and marijuana is still a very highly rated illegal drug under the federal law. So clients who are federal contractors have to worry about that, but you're not required to test for it. There was an opinion issued back in the 1990s that said just because you have to have a drug-free workplace doesn't mean you have to test for it. The only problem, I'll just say one more thing, then I'll turn it over to the other panelists. The real issue now is if somebody wants a commercial driver's license, they do have to be tested for marijuana. And I've been told that's one of the reasons. I've heard this from many people. People are having a really hard time hiring commercial drivers, people with CDLs, because marijuana use is so prevalent now. So I guess the bottom line is you should not test for marijuana anymore at all, unless it's for a CDL.
No, you probably have more life, experience with it. I just remember when we changed our requirements to not test for THC anymore, and it's awkward, and we tell our candidates that because, otherwise they, probably wouldn't apply for the job. We just have to be realists, so it's awkward.
Yeah, as the only part I would add to that is we do have some clients who are still pretty adamant about reasonable suspicion testing. And so we have just advised them in terms of best practice that if they feel strongly based on observable behaviors that someone is under the influence at work, that, they use a observable behavior form. They have someone else, engage in that with them, possibly two managers who can say, yes, we have observed this person. These are the reasons why we believe they're under the influence, and then kind of go from there. But we do a lot of, please make sure you're, going to your employment counsel and getting counsel advisement, because this is a newer and contentious subject. So yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of it.
One of the big challenges with marijuana is that the active ingredient from marijuana stays in your body for like about 28 days. So if you do a urine test, you're not going to know if somebody smoked a joint on the way to work in the morning, or if they were at a party 3 weeks ago and smoked a joint, which is why what you said is exactly what you have to do now. It has to be behavioral based things, which is a lot easier said than done, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and our last question under recruiting and onboarding, as employers, reworking your benefits package may seem like one small task or one small item on our never-ending checklist, but this may be the added push future employees need to select over another competitor. So what kinds of unique benefits have you noticed from those who work with related topics?
Well, yeah. I'm limited here because we are governed by corporate. So as much as we locally can say, hey, these are the things we need, or these are the things that we should look into, when you have 9,000 employees, it's not an easy change. So we can advocate for it locally and we may believe in it, but at the end of the day, we're a cheerleader for our corporate as well. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. What we can control, we do try and leverage. So PTO, time off, those types of things we can deal with. But as far as true benefits, medical and those types of things, we just advocate as loud as we can be.
Yeah, and I think too, it's looking outside of the box, right? Maybe not always thinking about your typical medical, dental, vision, because sometimes you can't change those. Sometimes those are out of your control. So what other benefits can you offer that maybe you can control? We've seen people adding on things like, like pet insurance as an option. And again, sometimes you can control that, sometimes you can't. That depends on the package, but things like pet insurance, like wellness plans that allow, for financial wellness plans that give people access to things like a tax consultant and identity theft and all those types of things. But it's really just thinking outside of the box. So yes, how can you update your paid time off package? We have seen people do things like add time off for when you get a pet now, because that's a new thing that a lot of people have done. Yeah, it's very interesting. I know, it's crazy. But it really depends on your demographic that you're trying to bring in. So you have to know what type of employees you're looking for. If you tend to be hiring people over here who have no interest in pets and things like that, and maybe they're more interested in financial wellness, that's something you want to look at. But maybe you're a company who's hiring a younger demographic, or Gen Z or things like that. They're going to be interested in something else. So that's a big part of it too, is knowing what maybe generationally you're targeting to, because everyone wants something different now. Gen Z is really big on volunteer work. So a lot of times they want to see that you're going to give them time off to volunteer. Community time off is becoming increasingly more popular. And then really, like, advertising for your company and culture is a benefit too. What type of culture do you provide there? Are you flexible? Do you provide flex work benefits? Do you allow for half-day Fridays? Do you allow for, 4-day work weeks if they work longer hours? Do you allow for telecommuting, remote work? All of these are type of things that are non-traditional benefits. So if you can't change the traditional benefits, you got to think outside the box and think about what you can offer and how flexible you can be.
Megan, you had mentioned that there are some things maybe that you advocated for, might advocate for, but some smaller businesses and organizations that don't have the corporate structure. Are there anything, is there anything in that pool that you've given some thought to that might be applicable?
Well, all those things she mentioned, we do them. We do flex time, but at the end of the day, we're manufacturing. So the majority of our employees, they do have to have a start time and end time. People are relying on them to be relieved to go so they can go home and the next group of employees come. But our office, so we kind of have to be a little careful too with how we balance that. But we do offer flex time, or at the end of the day, you don't need to take a vacation day to go to a doctor's appointment or things like that. Just make it work at the end of the week. Get your job done. That's our biggest thing. Don't micromanage as a manager. Just see that your employees are getting their job done, and don't worry the fact that they had to leave, an hour early today, because at the end of the day, at the end of the week, I'm sure they've made it up. And obviously, if they hadn't, that's a different discussion. But kind of just work with your employees. Be real. At the end of the day, I say I probably would be fired today if I was an hourly employee. My child had a bad morning, so guess what? I'm a little late, but that's okay. I'm allowed to be, and I'll make that up later. So just being real with the employees, and you have to be a little more patient and a little more real than you had to be maybe 5-10 years ago.
I would very much appreciate days off for pet care, because it would save my rugs and my floors over the years of the dogs that we've brought in.
Yeah.
So, moving on, right? Okay. So moving on to managing staff and operations. What are some of the resources to everybody to keep up with changes in requirements from state and federal officials regarding managing staff and HR compliance? It's a big field. There's a lot of regulatory bodies that are going to push things out. So how does somebody in a small business, or somebody who's not necessarily giving all of their attention to HR, how do they prioritize? Where do they focus, and where can they get the best information?
So And I don't mean to sound like I'm plugging Alcott HR, but I do have to say our clients use Alcott HR. So we are responsible for our clients for keeping them up to date on changes in state, federal regulation, all of those type of things coming down the pipeline. But a PEO is just one option for you, right? Everyone, that's not the right fit for them. So that's one option, but I would also say, it can be helpful to join organizations that, will have events, even if you're maybe, not solely focusing on HR all the time, you could still, possibly get a SURE membership or join a local HR organization that does legal updates. Another really helpful thing is there's several law firms that will do webinars, free webinars. We, as HR professionals, do them all the time. We sign up for things like Jackson Lewis, Littler. There's some local ones as well. And you just get on their email list and they send out their webinars and you just hop on some of those and they're really, really informational. So I would say, at a minimum, get yourself on some, some of those lists so that you can start attending those webinars. And then you can always go up from there if you feel you need some more support.
I would just add on that Chautauqua Works puts on a really great, every 6 months, and actually there's one today, this afternoon in Jamestown. I've gone to them for years and they're very beneficial. They have, a lawyer come down and they're very real. And it's open discussion, but they have an agenda and they usually just kind of, I call it Cliff Notes. They kind of touch on a little bit of everything to keep you out of trouble. And then you can always, attend further things to learn additional information, but it's a good start and it's a great way to network.
I've seen on Colligan's website that you've authored some of those types of articles that Emily is referring to. Anything else to add here, or any plug for Colligan here?
They both cover it pretty well. Our firm, we don't really do webinars, but we have a pretty active blog page on our firm website. We try and keep people up to date with legal developments in employment law and other legal areas that would affect business owners. So you can check that out if you want. But I think the other two panelists covered it very well. I don't have anything to add to that really. I would just say that I think they both mentioned networking. I think that's a very good thing to do. If you get active in SHRM or some other business group where you can meet with your peers and freely exchange information and ideas and questions, I think those are all very good ideas.
Great. Thank you.
All right, our next question. COVID has normalized remote work. What are some of the potential pitfalls of this practice and how can it be implemented in a way that minimizes liability and enhances productivity?
Joe, do you want to talk to that first from a compliance standpoint, or do you want us to start?
I don't, there are some legal issues there. I don't know if we're going to talk later on about all the legal issues of connected with the vaccine mandates, but I think I'd be interested to hear what you two had to say more from an HR viewpoint about remote work. I think the legal issues are not all that great at this point. I think it's more of a business HR issue from what I've seen, I think.
Yeah. I would say from an HR standpoint, with remote work in terms of like compliance, not from like a performance management standpoint, but you want to make sure that we would recommend best practice, have a policy in place, outline, your remote work from home policy, what you're expecting from employees, what they can and cannot do. If you have hourly employees who are working remotely, you need to have very clear conversations with them to make sure that they are tracking their time, all their time that they are working. If hourly employees are working remotely, anytime anyone's working remotely, it's a lot easier to hop on the computer, hop off the computer and do something else, hop back on the computer later on, check your emails at night. So just reminding, those non-exempt employees that they have to still be tracking their time accurately. That's the first thing that comes to mind when we tell people about remote work. But other than that, I would just say, figuring out how you're going to determine who's allowed to remote work. Are you going to have them complete a form when they want to request to do it? Or is it just, anyone's allowed? So you just kind of have to hash out those details. But I would say keep in mind any like FLSA, compliance things that you typically already have to follow in the workplace as well.
I don't have anything to add on the compliance side. I just, from dealing with it, in the workforce, I think it's a great benefit. I think, now with kids having to be quarantined all the time, you can't expect a babysitter to show up at the house for daycare and stuff. Like, you have to be flexible as an employer. Like, this is the world that we're living in and none of us asked for it. So we just have to be real. I encourage, we have an office that probably could all work from home, but they have come back into the office, but some have asked to, continue working from home. But I think the biggest thing you have to, as a manager, have to figure out is how to keep the team engaged, how to keep them, looking out for one another, being part of a team, and remembering that there are people in the workforce that are people that are showing up every single day. So, you have to have a reality check, I guess I call it. It's just that, not everyone's just sitting at the computer working from home and not being interrupted 55 times, in the real workforce. So you kind of just have to, depending on what your role is, keep that in perspective. And sometimes you might have to, as a manager, remind your employees about that, because they'll come up with some crazy projects and things for you to do, working from home. But the reality is it can't. You just gotta be mindful of the people that are in the workforce.
Good point. Thank you. Diversity is an important topic. What can be done to effectively manage and leverage the advantages of diversity in the workplace? And what steps need to be taken to ensure that all employees feel valued and respected in the workplace, and work to eliminate discrimination within it? Joe, do you want to maybe start with this one? I think this is one of the questions you teed up for us.
Let's talk about the legal aspects of this. I think this is more of an HR business issue. But legally, you want to make sure that you have, in your employee handbook, you have a non-discrimination policy. You want to make sure that you follow through on it, that if an employee makes a complaint that they're subjected to some type of unlawful discrimination, whether it's sexual harassment, racial harassment, anything like that, that you have a proactive process in place for investigating the complaint and taking any appropriate action afterwards. And I think training is an important thing too. I know our law firm, we just went through our sexual harassment training. The focus was primarily on sexual harassment, but I think it's important to focus on other types of illegal harassment and illegal discrimination also, to make sure that your employees are aware of the rights of their fellow workers.
From an HR standpoint, I would say obviously this, it's been around for a while, but the attention that's brought to it ebbs and flows. It is a big thing right now. I would say training as well, just from an educational standpoint, diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings are really helpful. Depending on your size, some companies will put a committee together. Some companies will just appoint one person to kind of tackle this piece of it. It's a huge topic. We could spend a whole day just talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I guess just like highlight a couple things that, we know people touch on. We talked a lot about hiring earlier. So that's a great area where you can focus on really diversifying, the workforce, looking at the ways you're recruiting, where are you advertising to. Referrals are a great option. However, you have to keep an eye on that too, because if you're a company that relies heavily on referrals, sometimes that can lead to not a lot of diversity in the workplace if the same people are referring all the time. So without even realizing it, that can kind of lend to that. So just keeping an eye on, from a hiring standpoint, how you're encouraging diversity, and diversifying your workforce.
I don't really have too much to add on that.
I will ask one follow-up question. This may be more directed towards Megan because of the community we're in. Language barriers, and looking at accommodating candidates with language barriers. Is that something that you deal with?
Yeah, all the time. And we just yesterday had another conversation about this. We're we're stuck essentially. It used to be, and it really can't be, is that like it was a requirement that you had to be able to at least take direction in English. Well, and it really comes down to safety and making sure we have SOPs or standard operating procedures. We have to be able to translate them into another language. Now there's a lot of different avenues you can use and help you translate that. But we as a company really honestly aren't there yet. But we're trying to educate ourselves and put ourselves in the position that we have to be able to diversify and be able to accommodate. And in the community that we're in, Spanish speaking is in the area, and if we want to be an employer here in this area, we have to move on with the time. So we're actually going to work with JCC a little bit on partnering with them to educate our supervisors and managers and what we can do to kind of accommodate that.
Okay, so moving on, our next topic is COVID mandates, including masking and vaccination. This has placed additional burdens on employers. What can be done to help manage these requirements? Which employers are most impacted by them? And how do small businesses respond for both compliance and safety?
Okay. Can I just start briefly by talking a little bit about where we are with these requirements now? Because it's a constantly moving target, as I'm sure you all know. There are two big vaccine mandates that came down from the federal government a couple months ago in executive orders from President Biden. One is the requirement that any employer with over 100 employees has to have everybody vaccinated, or you have to have proper protocols in place for unvaccinated people. The original deadline was early December. It was extended to, I think, January 18th now. But what's happened in the last couple of weeks, there have been several federal appeals court decisions that have taken inconsistent views on this new rule. There was at least one that said that it could not be enforced, others that said it should be enforced. So this is actually kind of, it seems a little bit humorous, but there's 11 different federal appellate courts in the US. And because these cases came from different appellate courts, they had to select one that would make a final decision. It's probably going to go to the US Supreme Court. So they actually had a lottery for the 11 federal appellate courts, and it ended up falling into the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is located in St. Louis. So they'll be deciding, I imagine it's probably on a fast track, they'll be deciding whether the mandate will be upheld or not upheld. And whichever way it goes, it's undoubtedly going to go to the Supreme Court. So that's the big one. The other one that actually affects probably potentially more people than the 100 employee plus is the requirement that any federal contractor or subcontractor has to have their employees vaccinated. That deadline, that was also originally in early December. It's been pushed off till early January now. But I imagine that there are some of you, I know we have some not-for-profits here. If any of you get money from a federal government agency, or if you're a subcontractor to somebody who gets money from a federal government agency, a lot of my clients have gotten letters. If you haven't gotten them already, you may get a letter informing you of this executive order and telling you that they expect you to comply with it, which means not only that you have to comply with it, but your subcontractors have to comply with it. Just for a quick example, one of my clients, they're pretty successful business. They're not a real big company, but they're a subcontractor to some federal government contractors. So they're going to have to comply with it, but they also have to have their subcontractors comply. Because my clients, we have this little, mailing, this little company does mailing for us. It's only got a couple employees. Do they have to comply with it? And the answer is yes. So I think that requirement is not getting as much attention as the over 100 employee one, but I think it has the potential maybe to affect a lot more businesses. And I'll let the other two panelists talk about how you deal with these things on an HR management level, which is a very complicated thing.
Yeah, it is constantly changing. It's very difficult, I think, for anyone. I mean, I guess I could be wrong, but I would venture to say that most people would agree that it's very difficult to stay on top of it. So I think that's just it. It's being aware that it's ever changing. Similar to what we were talking about with just any regular compliance things. find a resource that you trust, that you like, that is giving updates on these types of things, and just, keep checking in, keep following. Obviously there's a lot of changes going on, right now with these federal, mandates, from a New York State standpoint. When it comes to like COVID leave, there is still the New York State emergency COVID leave that is available to employees. But what they receive depends on the size you are of an employer. There's also the vaccine time in New York State. So those are two ones to be aware of. But there's New York State has great resources right on their website where you can go. They have FAQs, they have forms to be filled out. So it's very, very helpful just to go read up on that. And then for, guidance and recommendations, we're constantly checking the CDC. You have to just be aware that all situations are different. So it's just constantly checking those state websites, the CDC, and just kind of trying to stay on top of what the updated guidance is. But just knowing it's ever changing. And we tell our clients that all the time. We're like, this is the best practice today, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the best practice tomorrow. So.
Everything in addition to what they said is just, the reality is it's probably a matter of time before we have to, or just as a company, we might say that is a requirement. So we're trying to incentivize our employees to get vaccinated. We're not requiring them at this point in time, but we're doing gift cards on top of the New York State requirement pay that you can leave work early and get paid up to 4 hours. Our company is in addition paying 4 hours for them just to get the vaccine. So I think that's helpful. We've had vaccine clinics on site. We'll make appointments for employees that aren't able to do it on site or don't want to for whatever reason. Just be very, very accommodating, when they are getting the shot, and working with them, and they might call in for the next 2 days. So kind of just being very flexible in the real aspect of it all.
I would just like to add one more thing. That those are really great comments. I think I read a report just this morning that said that even though the future of the 100 employee plus requirement is still up in the air, depending what the courts decide, that a majority of employers who would be covered by it are already moving ahead to get their workforces vaccinated. So I think a lot of companies aren't going to wait and see what the Supreme Court says. They're just moving ahead already with it, which I personally believe is the right thing to do. But
and the last thing we require now indoors that if you're in the facility, you have to wear a mask, and no one really enjoys wearing a mask. And in manufacturing, it can get hot and dirty and just really annoying, when you're on that floor working. So if we can get to 80% vaccination rate, we will allow the masks to come off. So we're trying to kind of show our employees, we're very real with them. We're straightforward. We tell them where our numbers are at. That can kind of encourage them to, like, you know what, I'll suck it up and go do it,
Tough topic. Thank you for your insight. Performance management, employee discipline, and morale can require full-time effort, even in a small business. How can people prioritize these areas, and what aspects of employee management can provide the greatest return in your experiences for both the employer and the employee?
You repeat that beginning part. It was long.
So I guess bottom line with the question is there's a lot of things that go into employee management. In your experience, what are some of the things that you might be focusing on that provide the greatest return for both the employer and the employee?
I think an understanding of what the employee's role is, in their job, and having open communication with their manager. At the end of the day, if they understand what their job expectations are, what their goals and objectives are, and they're having constant communication about that, not just when they did wrong, not just because, we're doing our 6-month evaluation. An employee really should never find out 6 months later that they're doing a terrible job. They should know it, or if they're having an issue, or, something's come up, deal with it right then and there. It should never be a surprise, really, for either one of them. And I think if you have those clear goals and objectives, it solves a lot of problems.
Absolutely. To build on that, you know, most people want to know if they're not doing something correctly or if they can improve on something. So that open communication, that constant open communication is so important because if you're immediately giving that feedback, you're not only helping the employee, but then they're going to start improving, which is helping you. Also, I think a big piece of it is paying just as much attention to your top performers as you do to people who may be struggling. You know, obviously you need to address those people who need more guidance or, you know, who are underperforming, but you want to make sure that you're not just piling things on your top performers because they're doing it and they're doing it well. You know, you want to make sure you're having valuable conversations with them too on, you know, hey, like, how can we like help you continue to grow? You know, what are stretch assignments that we can give you? You know, again, setting those goals is so helpful. Because you want to make sure that they don't get bored and that they feel like they have those opportunities for professional development as well. And setting goals is also important because you're getting the employee buy-in. So, you know, you want them to set goals and then you discuss them together. And then you're making sure that they're mutually beneficial. Not only is the employee buying in and they're motivated, but you're making sure that those goals are in line with something that's going to help the company as well.
If I can just add one thing to that, those are great comments. The one piece of advice I give my clients, anytime you have a significant meeting with an employee, whether it's about a performance issue or a disciplinary issue, if it's something that could conceivably result in some kind of either discipline or termination, and this is just a common sense thing, I always recommend my clients that you have 2 members of management present at the meeting, and that after the meeting, somebody makes, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a handwritten or simple typed description of what happened at the meeting, then have both managers sign it and put it in the file in case you ever need to prove that the employee was warned about whatever the problem was. I mean, it's just a common sense thing, but I think it's something that could be very helpful if you got in a situation where, let's say, you terminated an employee and they brought some kind of a claim against you.
Some common examples staff report to employers, HR, maybe lack of consistency, communication, or lack of response and support from maybe higher ups, administration. So how do we keep employees from going to HR, and what is the first step in working on such related issues?
We always coach our supervisors, managers, ourselves to talk to our employees. So much can be resolved just by talking to them and going to them where they're at. Don't make them come to you. You know, if they're floor employees working on a machine, go down on the floor, go put your hard hat and boots on it and go talk to them where they're at. You know, it just shows, you know, they respect you a little bit more. That builds trust. And I think with respect and trust and conversation and just being open and real, a lot can be resolved and kind of prevented right there.
Absolutely. I think communication is so key. And in addition to that, and the hope is that this is not your first, you know, line of defense here, but you have to hold your managers accountable. And that can be really hard because, you know, they're busy, you know, they have a lot going on, but their management, they're held to a higher standard. You know, if you have multiple employees who are coming to you because there's an issue with consistency or they're not getting responses back from their manager, you need to sit down with the manager and figure out, you know, what's going on. You know, is it because they don't have enough support? Do they not have enough bandwidth? What can you do to help them do their job better? So it doesn't always have to be a negative conversation, but, you know, if you're seeing a pattern in employees coming to HR instead of going to supervisors, you know, figure out what that pattern is. Is that your supervisors need more resources and training to address, you know, the issues, or is it that they need more support in terms of their bandwidth because they can't be responsive to employees? So I think those are, you know, holding them accountable, but, you know, having those open conversations as well and listening to what they need.
Thank you. Resignations and terminations are inevitable. You know, employees leave for better opportunities. It may be a mutually beneficial exit. But what are some essential steps when an employee is exiting the workplace?
I think one of the biggest things is understanding why they're leaving. You know, talking with them, you know, at the point they obviously when they give you the resignation, but also we give them a chance to not only talk with us, but we like have a questionnaire survey that we provide them, and we self-address it, you know, to put a stamp on it so that they might feel more comfortable telling you after they leave than while they're still finishing off their 2 weeks or whatnot. You just kind of have to give them different avenues to speak if there really is an issue that maybe they don't want to bring forward to you. So I think exit interviews, and maybe not necessarily, it doesn't have to be formal, you know, come in at 1 o'clock for an exit interview, but just, you know, making sure you make that time to kind of understand the whys. Should probably already know a little bit before they do that.
Yeah, you know, I think from a legal point of view, the main benefit of the exit interview is to find out if there are any issues that the employee that cause the employee to leave that you don't know about. Because you don't want to have an employee leave and then 2 weeks later you got a complaint from the Division of Human Rights that they were being subjected to sexual harassment that caused them to quit the job. I mean, one good thing about the exit interview, if you ask a question like that, why did you leave? If they don't raise it at the exit interview, it gives you at least some basis for challenging a complaint that they might make later on that they never told you about. So I think it's, like I said before, you should have a written record of it like any other significant communication with the employer. I think exit interviews are a good idea.
I'm coming at it from a process standpoint as well. Just making sure that you have your ducks in a row. Similar to a new hire checklist, it can be helpful to have a termination checklist. Making sure that you know, if IT is a factor, you know, make sure that, you know, IT's been made aware if, you know, access needs to be turned off. Do they have any property that you need to get back from them? It can be really helpful to have, we would actually recommend as best practice that you have someone else sit in on that termination conversation, especially if you think it's someone who might get emotional in whatever way that may be. And just, you know, having a clear understanding of what they're being terminated for, being very straightforward in the conversation. We recommend, it's not best practice to ever apologize during a termination conversation, but yeah, just from a process standpoint, making sure you know, understand and have in line the different steps you need to take. And then I'm kind of maybe stealing Joe's thunder here, but you know, in New York State, you have to send a termination letter within a certain amount of time after terming the employee. So it can be very helpful to have documentation and to, you know, have your checklist handy so you make sure that you don't miss anything and that, you know, you have your reason documented in case, you know, anything does come up down the line. You can go back and, you know, reference that.
Yeah, those are good comments. One more thing I would add is I recommend to my clients, in terms of having the employee get their personal possessions out of their office or out of their work area, if there's any chance at all that the employee is going to be disruptive in any way, I mean, even if you're not worried about them being violent, if they're going to break down and start crying and, you know, upset everyone else in the office, what I recommend, one option is to have the person come back after working hours. But my preference, though, is to just escort the person, have them leave, and then have two managers go through all their personal possessions, make a written inventory of it, have both of you sign the inventory, and then have their personal possessions delivered by a delivery service or a cab or something like that. The reason you want to have two people do it and sign off on it is you don't want the employee to say, well, I had a $100 bill on my desk drawer, somebody must have stolen it. So I think that's, if there's any chance at all that the person coming to get their possessions, either during working hours or even after working hours, if there's any chance at all that's going to be disruptive, that's the process that I recommend to my clients.
Thank you, Joe. Our next question, how can an organization safeguard its reputation and manage negativity from former employees? Especially in a small town.
A very difficult task. Like, you can't essentially control other people. If you could, our lives would probably be a lot more simple. But I guess the biggest thing is to advocate for your current employees and show them the trust and the respect and being honest with them and straightforward. It's fairly simple things, but you have to make an effort to do those things. So you really can't necessarily truly control the outside people, but you can control, you got to focus on what you can control.
I don't have too much to add to that. It's pretty accurate.
The only thing I would add, and this would only affect probably very, very small percentage of terminated employees, but if you have your employees sign a severance agreement, if they give them some kind of severance pay in exchange for a severance agreement release, severance agreements universally will say that the employee can't disparage the employer when they leave. They can't badmouth the employer. But you're right, other than that, you don't have a whole lot of control of what people say unless they've agreed not to badmouth their former employer. There's not a whole lot you can do about it, really. I mean, if they say things that are not true, you could threaten to sue them for defamation or something, but that's, most cases, that's not worth the effort and the expense.
Tough topic, and that one actually did come from somebody who had registered similarly anyway. One more question, and I am going to go off script here, so I'll apologize in advance. And kind of going back to the top when we look at onboarding, as we promote this event with our young professionals, something that's obviously very important is, as young professionals in their career, first, I guess, what can they do to stand out as they kind of solidify their own resumes and build their own experience? What are some things as HR managers in particular, what are you looking for, and how do they get their resume on top of the pile?
It's a tough question. I would say that from my own experience, in recruiting, and then from speaking with our talent acquisition specialists, it sounds common sense, but not always. But making sure you have a clean resume, making sure that, if you can keep it to a page, that's ideal. However, it depends on the position you're applying for. If you really need to be, talking about your in-depth experience, but I would say keep it to 2 pages unless you're applying to be like a professor and, you have to do a CV and stuff. But other than that, I would say 1 page ideal, 2 pages tops. But make sure it's clean and concise and organized. I read through resumes. I notice when people have, grammatical errors, and I'm talking about like little teeny grammatical errors, but if there's a million typos in a resume, that shows that you don't have good attention to detail. It shows that you didn't care enough about the position. Same thing with, we've noticed, people will put their little like summary at the top. If you're talking about a different job or a different type of job, it's not going to look so great when that other person is looking at it. So those are little things that are, you would think that a lot of people, know that, but they don't. So those are little things that are going to really put you above, the rest. And then also, I've really started to notice that titles change a lot now. Not everyone has the same title. So make sure that you find, a way to describe your responsibilities in a clear and concise way. But more and more frequently, we're looking at the person's responsibilities, what they accomplished in the position, as opposed to the title. Again, obviously it's all situational. It depends on the position. But, HR is a great example. We all have different titles. You have HR generalist, specialist, business partner, advocate, so you can't always look at that title, but that's why it's important to make sure that you're selling yourself in the best way possible, talking about your accomplishments, what you did, and all of those types of things on that resume.
I don't really have too much to add. Just as the candidate, if you're trying to stand out, making sure you're aligned with the company and you believe in their morals and their values and what they stand for. They're about partnering with the community. Make sure you like doing that and making, when that's a passion of yours, more natural. I don't really have too much.
I do have one comment on that too. On the flip side, with managers or supervisors or leadership roles, whoever's in a leadership role, it's important to look at the resume also. It may not stand out, but there may be individuals that you may look at maybe overqualified, and just kind of digging a little deeper. I had an example just last week on that. There was someone that had the title Dr. So-and-so, and I sent the resume to the hiring supervisor and immediately they said, oh, this person's overqualified for the position. And so then the individual ended up calling us, expressing more interest in it. And so I reached out to her and I was just asking questions of, why are, you interested in this position? Do you know about the organization? She wanted more of a position that was 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, instead of at Home Depot where she's currently working, where they're asking her to work on the weekends, and she has her kids on the weekends. So there was just more digging that I did, and then I presented it to the supervisor, and they were like, "Oh, I didn't realize that." So always just keep that in mind too, and just don't always go by the resume. There might be something that may stand out.
Yeah, and keep in mind, like, what role are you hiring for? And the hiring manager's like, can I have a resume? A resume is not going to be great on a mechanic. They don't work very well on computers. They work with their hands. So you have to be a little bit real. And as the recruiting specialist, you have to also perhaps call people that may not have very much on their resume because, they might just be poor resume, but usually they can sell themselves in the interview. So just kind of being open-minded to the type of role that you're hiring for and having realistic expectations.
We did want to open up the floor for questions at this time. So what are you wondering about? What questions do you have? Either for Joe or Emily or for Megan. We have the experts in front of us, so don't hold back. Tyler?
Thank you all. It was really informational. I learned a lot. Question for me, what size company, how many employees do you think would require hiring a full-time HR person, professional? And then what size company do you think requires a full HR department or more than one HR professional?
Before we have the panel answer, Joe, could you hear that question? Are you able to hear from the audience?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I'll defer to the two HR experts on that, because legally there's no requirement that you have to have an HR department if you reach a certain size. And this is just very sort of rule of thumb off the top of my head. I think most companies don't hire a full-time HR person until they get maybe somewhere around 50 employees. But I'd be curious to say what my two fellow panelists think about that. But there's no absolute rule about when you have to hire an HR manager or have a fully staffed HR department.
Well, from my perspective, which is slightly different, I think one, it depends on your resources, right? So we have clients that we work with who are, anywhere from 50 to 100 employees who don't have a specified HR person because they have us. So, we're there, we have to have a client contact who, is comfortable enough to be, maybe boots on the ground administering certain things. But I would say that we do notice that once you get to that 75 plus, it is very helpful to have at least one HR person, maybe not necessarily full-time, but at least one HR person full-time or part-time in the location to deal with those day-to-day things. And then we're assisting, in supplementing that and providing best practice. But I would say we have clients that we work with who are, maybe 200 who, only have one HR person. You may be able to speak to it better than I can. I think once you have to know your company, right? So it depends, on what you're looking to accomplish. I think when you're getting into the, 200s, 300s, things like that, you're going to need an HR department that's continuously growing as your company grows to address that. I think once you're, as I said, once you get to that 75 plus, it can be helpful to have at least one HR person. But if you don't work with someone like Alcott, it probably is a much lower number than that, to have at least one HR person on staff. I would say that if you don't have a company like Alcott that you work with, you'd probably want an HR person on staff at, honestly, as low as 10. Again, maybe they're part-time, but maybe they do other responsibilities, but there's a lot, as you guys are learning, that goes into HR, and, you want to be cognizant of that. So, but it's a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I'll just share what we do have. So there's 3 of us in our department, but we have over about between 450 and 465 on our Dunkirk campus. Could argue we could always use more help, but it kind of just depends. We're 24/7 too, so we have to make ourselves available for the employees. And of those 460-ish employees, about 65 of them are all office employees. So you can manage them a little bit easier. You can communicate through email. You're not spending a great deal of time with them. But because we are 24/7 and because we're dealing with different languages, different cultures, different, at different capacities, that's why there's a need for 3.
Other questions? Dan?
Sure, thank you. Great information. And I'm wondering, what would be the best or most appropriate way to find out someone's vaccination status and bring them on board? Like ask them, form, check yes or no, what would be the best way?
Adam, this is Joe. Could you please repeat that question? I didn't hear it too clearly.
The question was, what is the best way to find out about an employee's vaccination status when bringing them on board?
Joe, do you want to answer that or do you want us to take it?
I would say ask them to give you their vaccination card. Ask to show you the vaccination card. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. And I just want to say, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but I've had one experience already with a client who had an employee who had what turned out to be, we believe, a counterfeit vaccination card. So that's something, and I'm not sure how you tell a counterfeit from a real one, but that's something you need to watch out for. But I would just ask the person to show their vaccination card.
Yeah, I can share what we're giving as best practice. It depends, obviously, if your company is mandating or not. But if it's not mandating, then we would not recommend necessarily asking that during the hiring process. Instead, once they come on board, just as Joe said, you can just ask them, if they're vaccinated, you'd like to see their vaccination card, assign one person, if there's someone who's responsible for HR, assign that person to control that process and be the one person that it's going to, and they really should only be sharing that information as needed. It is completely fine to, keep the copy of the vaccination card on record, but it just needs to be separate from the personnel file, as you would with like doctor's notes or things like that. We also, just as a reminder, if you're asking them if they're vaccinated or not, if they are not, you don't want to ask why they're not. Just handle it the way you would need to handle it. But, that's where you start getting into sticky territory. If you're simply just asking if they are or they aren't, and making a copy and putting it in a file to keep track of that, there's nothing wrong with that.
Follow-up question.
Yeah, I just want to add one, those are excellent comments. I agree with what you said. The one thing is and it's still a little bit unclear what's going to happen with these federal mandates, but it's possible that an employee may claim either religious or have objections to being vaccinated or have some medical reason not to be vaccinated. So if somebody says, no, I'm not vaccinated because I have this medical condition, or because I have a religious belief that contradicts vaccination, you have to at least hear them out on that and see what they have to say about it. And then you've got the right to ask for information to back it up too. But that's just one more, in all this complicated world we live in, that's just one more thing that you have to keep in mind.
So I just have a follow-up question in regards to that. So we don't mandate vaccination. However, our partners that we work with mandates. We work with a lot with the school districts. So you recommend us not asking if they're vaccinated, but we need to know because they go into schools.
And that's why it's case by case, right?
Okay.
So I would.
Is there anything legal on why we shouldn't?
I would say, Joe, you can speak to that in addition if you want, but we do have a client that we work with who they don't mandate it, but they subcontract with some schools who do. So what I have told, what Alcott has given them as best practice, one, we always recommend consult, employment counsel if you have someone you work with. But if they are able to still, because, and again, I don't know, if you work with anyone else, they don't solely work with companies who require it. It's just some of their partners. And so at this point, they're able, for their small amount of people who aren't vaccinated, they're still able to function and put them on other jobs. If it's a point where the only companies you're partnering with are ones that are mandating it, then you can let someone know at hiring, as you're going through that process, hey, we partner with, companies or organizations that require it. So it is, we do have a mandate because you have to, because they have to be able to do their job. And then that's where the accommodation piece comes in. And then that you kind of have to go off of, based on, what they come forward with.
Yeah, let me just add one thing to that. If this is, if your school district, if the reason that you're in the situation is because somebody's getting some sort of federal money and they're considered a federal contractor or a subcontractor, that federal mandate that I spoke about earlier, it's much stricter than the 200 employee one in the sense that any employee who works for the company, even if they're not working on the federal contract or subcontract, if they work in a contiguous work area with people who are working on the contract, or even if they're working at home, they have to be covered if they're working on a contract, or if you're in an office building, unless they're in a separate building or on a separate floor where nobody is working on the federal contract, everybody has to be vaccinated. But as I said, it's a moving target. This could all change in the next couple of weeks. We don't know what the final outcome is going to be.
Any other questions? And we will now move to closing remarks. If each of you want to just take a couple minutes to maybe address anything that you think is important that didn't come up today, or just leave us with some parting wisdom.
I don't really have, I just think being real. People will come up to me and they'll want to deal with me in the office because they're like, you're just real. You just tell us as it is. Simple, I think, is a little bit better, especially with the clientele that I'm dealing with, and just being honest and communicate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. I have a background in communication, so I feel very strongly about it, but it bleeds into every single type of work you do. And it's really the basis of a lot. So, just make sure you're communicating with your employees, because you find a lot during those conversations, and then, take it from there. Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
And the only thing I would add to that, after spending a good part of my career assisting employers who have legal issues in the workplace with their employees, I think the best way to avoid that and the best way to have a good, productive workforce is it's very simple. Just treat people with dignity and respect. I think that's what I would say. That's what it comes down to, and I think that pretty much echoes what you two both said too.
Thank you so much to our panelists, Megan, Emily, and Joe. Very eye-opening, very educational for me, and I'm sure for our audience here today. Can we have a hand for our panelists? My takeaway is somebody had, I think a couple of times the word common sense was used by the panelists, and dignity and respect and being real and all of those things that go into making a really competent HR manager that sometimes get taken for granted, but it's nice to hear that reinforced and knowing that the companies that you all work with are in such great hands. Some special thanks, of course, to Monica, who has been behind the screen working in our virtual and getting our technology set up. Thank you to Alicia for co-facilitating with me and helping out up here. And a huge thank you to Egg Team, Edwin and the team over there for sponsoring this event and helping to make this possible. Thank you for all you do for our community. Thank you, everybody. We'll start to wrap up. We'll cut off our broadcast there. And I'm sure if there's any questions in the last few minutes before